Karsten, Jeff, Stuart, Andrew. Good to see you all. Just wait for YouTube to get going. All right. So this is our last session. Um, we're going to take a little break after this book, but we'll be back at it soon. So I don't know exactly when or what book we might read. If you all have suggestions, we can talk about that towards the end. But it'll probably be a few months before we pick it up again. Um, Let me say a few words about these final pages. So Steiner reviews the threefold nature of the human being and the four bodies, and their relationships. I won't dwell too much on that other than to point out what he says. He uses this example of Goethe and Schiller. He says that when our thinking activity can get closer to the will, it gets closer to the will, which is typically where we're asleep, when our thinking dives into the play of fancy or imagination. And Steiner gives the example of Goethe, who was very adept at this imaginative form of cognition, um, whether he was writing his poetry or observing nature. And Steiner says that this is why Goethe needed Schiller to help him interpret his own poetry and his own sort of dreamlike writing. Schiller, on the other hand, had very powerful will forces and was drawn to these great ideals, these moral ideals. And so Goethe and Schiller were an ideal pair because they helped balance each other, where Goethe was vulnerable to Ahriman, who um, wants to cut us off from our past evolution and redirect us. Um, Ahriman can prey especially on those with the natural power of fancy directed to nature, right? So someone like Goethe, whereas Lucifer, who wants to keep us in the past, can prey on those with these powerful will forces who love the ideal world, like Schiller. Um, so these two, Goethe and Schiller, um, they create a tension and protect one another from these temptations in a way similar to, say, Goethe and Wordsworth would be another ideal pair like that. Steiner emphasizes in the first part of this final section just the way that we stand, the human being stands between the intelligibility of the stars with their calculable cycles and the unintelligibility of the earth with all of its irregular events like, you know, weather and earthquakes and eruptions. And so he's presenting this image of the human being as um, a polarity between thinking, which is, Steiner says, sourced in the stars. We have this cosmic organization in our thinking, and our willing rooted in the chaos of the earth, with feeling um, mediating between the two. He then goes into the history um, of the transition from the intellectual soul to the consciousness soul, and discusses how in the 19th century we had reached this phase of the consciousness soul where natural science was blossoming, but our conception of um, knowledge increasingly was just limited to nature, and we lost any sense that we might have knowledge of the spirit. Um, and we lost the sense that art and religion too might be genuine forms of spiritual knowledge. Um, Knowledge was just reduced to sense-bound uh, intellectual abstraction, basically building models of external nature. And in terms of our spiritual and religious life, at this point, people could only turn to tradition that they could believe in, and maybe some people felt like in earlier periods of human history there was a true um, that earlier peoples had methods of truly contacting the spiritual world. Um, but by the 19th century, all the human being could do was believe in these religious traditions. There was no ability to know uh, spirit anymore. We could either believe or we could doubt, but
Another
knowledge
when I was saying,
was not possible. Uh, Sorry, let me mute you, Mark. Then he goes a little bit further into history and talks about the Roman Empire closing the Greek mysteries, which led the spiritual custodians who were attending to those mysteries to flee. They ended up in Gandhi Shapur in Asia, which Steiner says was established through Alexander the Great's influence. And there was a kind of the Arab world was preserving a kind of Aristotelian philosophy, preserving and developing there, and that the consciousness soul was coming forth too early um, as a result of these activities at Gandhi Shapur, and it spread from there and brought a certain intellectualism across northern Africa and southern and western Europe. And as Steiner describes it, it was as though a wave of spiritual knowledge appropriate for the consciousness soul period, which would come later, but premature at this point, was washing over Europe in the seventh and eighth centuries, making Europe prematurely intellectual, not in the intellectual soul sense, in the abstract modern scientific sense. Um, and that this would have the later consequence by the 19th century of us, of human beings losing direct contact to the spiritual world, even while we were really buoyed by this pride in the power of our natural scientific knowledge. Now, Steiner here talks about it's translated as Arabism, and I think he seems to be speaking about the influence of the Islamic philosopher Averroes and Averroism, which is what Thomas Aquinas was um, sort of battling against. Averroes was arguing that there's only one active intellect, that all human beings share this one intellect, and that there is no individual soul that's immortal, that when we die, we just sort of disappear. And Aquinas was resisting this, defending the individuality of the immortal soul and the way in which this active intellect was actually incarnate in each living soul and body. Um, and so I think that's what Steiner has in mind more particularly. It's just I'm not sure what the original term was. It's translated as Arabism here. I think he's talking about Averroes and the influence of Averroes. And Aquinas isn't mentioned, but um, some of you may know, Steiner has a special relationship, let's say, to Aquinas. And I feel like he's speaking to that conflict between Thomas Aquinas's defense of individual soul and intellect and immortality, um, arguing against Averroes and this idea of one intellect for all of humanity. Steiner then goes over the debate between realism and nominalism and the way that the realists they could hear the speech of the logos, but they could not understand it, which is to say the realists know that they knew that the ideas were substantial, um, but they couldn't interpret them. They lost a sense of the living spirit behind them. Meanwhile, the nominalists just denied that there was any reality to be heard, any ideas whatsoever. They're just conceptual labels. Of course, nominalism becomes modern science, which develops these imposing conceptual frameworks based on our observation of the outer world of the senses. And realism couldn't really compete or resist because it had no living firsthand experience of the ideas. And Steiner thinks this is anthroposophy's task in our time to revitalize realism by reconnecting us to the spirit within the ideas as a result of these new organs of spiritual cognition that we are trying to develop. So obviously in the 19th century, there are all these dazzling triumphs of natural science, but they were having a sorrowful effect on the soul and on our inner spiritual life. Um, Yeah, I want to say a little bit about what went into the evolution of consciousness that led up to this 19th century um, sorrowful situation. Steiner talks about the Greco-Roman development of the intellectual soul, and how the Greeks and the Romans perfected the intellectual soul, but they had nothing within their soul and spiritual forces to give rise to the consciousness soul. There was no seed for the consciousness soul there. And so he describes the handing off of the leading edge of the evolution of consciousness, or kind of the world spirit, to another peoples, the um, northeastern Franco-Germanic peoples, which would develop the consciousness soul. Um, these Franco-Germanic peoples had gone through the intellectual soul phase, but it was rooted more in their feeling life, less so in their thinking life, as it was for the Greeks and the Romans. And it was while the Greeks and the Romans experienced the Christian revelation as something coming to them from the outside, the Franco-Germanic peoples experienced this new Christian revelation inwardly, which was what allowed them to begin to birth this consciousness soul. But there was a lot of chaos at this time in the medieval period. Not only the nominalists and realists, but earlier than that, the early phases of Christianity, the Arians and the Athanasians were battling each other about the nature of Christ. Is Christ just a creature or co-eternal with the Father? Or is Christ the second member of the Trinity, the Logos, or just a sort of creation that's not fully divine? Um, so there's a lot of debate about the nature of Christ at this time, and Steiner seems to suggest that this is a reflection of the chaotic transition, right, from the intellectual soul to the consciousness soul, and the waves of premature intellectualism, right, that were crashing on the shores of Europe that I mentioned earlier. He then talks about the German idealists, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, that they were realists about ideas, but they were describing ideas emptied of the spirit, and claiming that ideas themselves were the creative substance of the universe rather than spiritual beings. Meanwhile, in the Anglo-American world, the utilitarian thinkers like John Stuart Mill were just reducing ideas to functional abstractions, totally divorced from spirit. And so this is a function of our spiritual organs being paralyzed, Steiner says. Um, and we were taking increasing pride in our one-sided natural scientific knowledge power, um, knowledge hyphen power, is the translation in my edition, which leads into what Steiner says at the close here about the development of technoscience and industry, which is quite prescient. This has only become more relevant to us today. That while in our thinking we still live in these mechanical uh, thoughts about the natural world, in our willing, Steiner says, we're actually inhabiting these subnatural forces that are being unleashed by our technology and our industry. Um, and these subnatural forces, electricity was a major one for Steiner in his time, shortly after he died, or a decade or so after, 15 years after he died. The bomb, um, nuclear bomb, was nuclear power was unleashed, which is another form of subnatural forces, and these are pulling us downward. And Steiner thinks that there's a real urgency for us to develop what he calls supernatural um, uh, perception and cognition and experience, or spiritual science, to help balance this downward pull um, below nature into the subnatural forces. More and more nowadays, in contrast to the 19th century, where there was still a sense that natural science was about gaining a theoretical understanding of a admittedly mechanical nature. Nowadays, and already 100 years ago in Steiner's time, science was becoming more about power, more about technological prowess, instrumentalized knowledge that didn't even pretend to be able to clearly theorize. It was more about just manipulating these subnatural forces to bring forth new convenient technologies or um, weapons of war. Um, and so this hyphenated term knowledge power becomes this new form of Ahrimanized uh, science that's not even natural science, but subnatural science or technoscience. All right, I think I'll stop there and invite conversation and dialogue. Jeff, please.
Thank you. Thanks for that summary, Matt. As always, it's absolutely crystal clear. I felt like um, I understand every time. I feel like I understand the text better when you've done this.
Good.
Um, thank God for people smarter than me. That's what I'd like to say about that. Um, it's interesting that this essentially this section, the last section, is subsequent to the one previous where he talks about the evolution of consciousness and the spiritual soul that is emergent during this time, but can't be emergent in the Greco-Roman culture. And you wonder what the circumstances are such that those um, organizations, as human beings, could not birth that, could not take the next metamorphic step that was um, in the ethers, so to speak. And then that makes me that subsequent chapter or section being about essentially our what I mean, how prescient is it? Like that the idea that the techno mechanical has entered our will, that we drive around in cars, it's very McLuhan-esque in that sense. And I would think that this is part of the stream of ideas that really influenced Owen Barfield saving the appearances, um, who did a better treatment, I think, than McLuhan, because he speaks of it as a sort of embodied um, 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 simulation, I guess is the right word. Um, and so I'm left with this question: uh, Are we occluding our own possibility of giving birth to the spirit self as the next as the seed that is the next emergent um, uh, phase in the evolution of consciousness? And if we understood that to be the case, might we like to avert that? That's that's my those are two questions. The one about the Greco-Roman culture, what were the circumstances such that those souls couldn't give birth to the spiritual soul, but had to receive it from the outside, and the other being um, what can we do and what are we doing that either fosters or occludes the possibility of giving birth to that next phase in evolution.
Yeah, good question. Um, I mean, if we means all the whole of humanity, um, I think inter or cross-cultural exchange is the way that we can transition from consciousness soul to spirit self. But for Steiner, it was the Eastern European Slavic peoples that would be prepared for that spirit self. And we need to accomplish something in the consciousness soul period, we being the, you know, Northern European and American peoples who have inherited that culture are developing this consciousness soul, and we have to do something that would help um, create the impetus for a different cultural epoch to develop spirit self. Um, and, it was very interesting to read this description of how these two cultural epochs, the Greco-Roman developing the intellectual soul, and then the Franco-Germanic developing the consciousness soul, and how that transition occurs. It seems somewhat chaotic and haphazard thing. But nonetheless, it's accomplished somehow. Um,
It seems to also have, I guess this is what got me really wondering about what the conditions are at the time, um, is that it seems to coincide with the decline of the civilization itself. The robustness of the civilization declined um, before the emergence of this, apparently, the emergence of this next phase of consciousness for humanity.
Mhm. Right, right. But you get the Greco-Roman um, really being responsible for the institutionalization of Christianity in the Roman Catholic Church. And Steiner seems to be saying it was always those, that's the more southern Mediterranean um, element that's maintaining a sort of intellectual soul version of Christianity. And it's the Germanic peoples in the north who have a more esoteric inner sense of what this Christ mystery was actually about, was what Steiner seems to be saying. And that later manifests in the Protestant Reformation, um, when there's that real break finally from almost like the ruins of the Roman Empire, and the administration of the Catholic Church, that sort of transition from being a worldly power to, oh, we'll just be a spiritual power now with some residual worldly power, um, until the Protestant Reformation. And then that, I think that's obviously when the consciousness soul is really coming into its own. Um, but yeah, in terms of the subtle anatomy of the Greco-Roman and why there was no seed for the consciousness soul there, that's I'd have to ponder that more. But let's see what Karsten, and yeah, Karsten, you go ahead first, and then Brian.
I know Andrew wants to raise his hand, but he cannot do it.
Oh,
So maybe should
we
let Andrew go first.
sure. Okay, go ahead, Andrew.
I think Karsten was up first, so I'll pass to Karsten, and then I'll go after him.
No, we're so polite. Okay.
Okay, I won't be polite then. Well, yeah, that's a good question, Jeff. Really good question. If Where are we heading right now collectively? I think I'm quite optimistic, and one reason is that I have a lot of, say, trust in the school of hard knocks that I heard you once called it. That humanities, I mean, we're moving into a lot of these are harsh times in many ways, and a lot of really bad things are going on. But I have trust in the, you could call the awakening power of all the hardness and the suffering that we're going through, but also this, what I talked about last time, this the experience of nihility, meaninglessness, and the way that it kind of stirs our imagination. I mean, I have a lot of conversations with young people, and I very often sense that they're very curious, and they all have this. Many of them, at least, have this sense that there must be more to life than what is presented for them at the end of education, so to speak. So I'm optimistic, but also, I mean, for example, I saw Matt, you shared this, you shared a reflection to what she called Graham Dempsey. What's his name? I forget all the time.
Brendan Graham Dempsey. Hmm.
Exactly, yeah. And his conversation with John Verweke, I think he's called. So I saw your reflection, but I also saw their dialogue. And I think that was kind of interesting. This question about how to revive, or if it's possible to revive Christianity. And we've talked about all these conversions that we are seeing, which also somehow there must be an expression of some kind of dissatisfaction with how things are presently. And and so I think this actually is, I mean, in Leading Thought 178, Steiner is talking about how spirituality was kind of delegated to tradition as an object of faith. And what is interesting about this, say, conversation about meta-modern Christianity is that it's moving beyond that. It's asking, is there something more to Christianity that we can kind of invoke into our present state of civilization? So I think there's a lot of very interesting conversations going on in different places. And I think we have to come to find this balance between tradition and the resources that are inherent in tradition, but also the kind of productivity of this experience of modernization and secularization, that it's a chance for renewal of spirituality. And I told you last time I was reading this Keiji Nishitani, and he had a set of lectures he called On Buddhism, where he's taking up this question about the relationship between modernization and the Buddhist tradition. And he had a very beautiful image that I think kind of ties into what Steiner is saying here when he's talking about Ahrimanic forces and Luciferian forces, where talking about Japanese culture, he's using the image of a kite, a kite that can fly, and how it's kind of stuck in a tree. And then there's this quote that I found very inspiring, where he says, like a kite caught in a tree, we must try to fly it once again from the beginning. It's quite important for us to ponder how to raise it higher and higher once we have been able to make it fly again. On the one hand, when a strong wind blows, the power of tradition must be put to work. But on the other, we cannot fly a kite if its tail is too heavy. It's of the utmost importance to strike a balance between these inclinations, toward modernization and change, and toward tradition. So I think this image of the kite, we kind of need to bring tradition with us to a certain extent, but it also needs to be renewed and understand again in the light of new experiences in the process of change and modernization. And I saw that your comment to Brendan Graham Dempsey was that you sensed that he had he was thinking about the Godhead as some kind of emergent property or being, but he didn't say that, but that's your kind of, I know you've had conversations with him, so there's probably more to it than. And then you went into this defense for the primordial nature of the Godhead, inspired by Whitehead, but also so that you had another battle going on. I'm saying battle in quotation marks because it's very friendly, with Michael Levin, where you felt called upon to defend the consequential nature of the Godhead and of the divine. So I think it's all about, we are having these forces creating this kind of field of tension, but it's all calling upon us to kind of strike this balance between that which comes, that which we've brought us with us from the past, and that which comes from the future, or that which comes from the heavens, the cosmic forces, and that which is subnatural, and so on. And I think it's very easy to see that when we do not strike this balance, we're in for a lot of trouble. And that is kind of my hope for the present times. It is that whenever we do not strike this balance, we create a lot of trouble for ourselves. So that kind of should motivate us to find the balance collectively.
Yeah, thanks, Carsten. One thing occurs to me as you're speaking about the developmental biologist Michael Levin's work is he just published. It's a preprint. It will be a chapter in the conference anthology that came out of the McGilchrist event last year. But it's about him articulating what he's been saying loosely on different podcasts, but hasn't really published on that. He really thinks we need a renewal of Platonism in biology to understand the source of biological form. And in reading this last week's session about the last section of Leading Thoughts about realism and nominalism, it seems to me that what Mike is affirming now is this realist insight that, biological form is not just, kind of what gets accumulated over the course of natural selection, um, but it's actually ingressing from some other realm. What he calls it the Platonic morphospace. And I think that's definitely moving in the right direction, but at the same time, um, he's giving agency to the ideas themselves, and there's no spirit in it, you know?
Yeah.
And so I'm seeing how that's there's something about his approach that obviously he's uh, um, dabbling in what could become a kind of etheric technology with his, but also it could become a kind of subnatural force with bioelectricity and all of that. And so it's like I'm very, it's not just curiosity, it's I feel a sense of urgency in being in dialogue with him about like how can we steer this in the right direction? Because it's a
But I,
very crucial moment in the history of the biological sciences right now that he's at the leading edge of.
I think you're onto something with this idea of that you have from Whitehead about the primordial versus the consequential. And it reminded me of something that I read in Martinus's work many years ago, which I've spent a lot of time trying to understand, because Martinus had this idea of a primordial desire that is inherent in the living being and is part of our immortality. You could say a basis for our immortality. And so it's the primordial desire is not any desire in particular, but it's desire in general. And that you could say the desire that the desire that life has for its own renewal, kind of pushing life forward. But then at one point he says that this primordial desire is determined from below, that the kind of the state of the primordial desire is determined from below, from the particulars, uh, which I've spent a lot of time thinking about. And what he's saying in a sense is that that which is the consequence of the primordial desire will kind of feed back into the primordial desire and and maintain it, you could say, kind of um, embody its particular state somehow. So you need this kind of loop between the, and also we've had these discussions where Lorenzo, he's been talking about the relationship between the future and the past and how the future can kind of feed back to the past or impact the past. So I think in this kind of interplay between the primordial and the consequential, there's something very important going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Carson. I want to give Brian a chance to chime in. Been patiently waiting.
And don't forget Andrew.
But yeah, I think Andrew was going to go next,
Oh,
actually.
right. Sorry, Andrew.
It's okay. No worries.
Gotta update your Zoom.
I know, I do. I have to. It's my school Zoom. Um, Couple things. First, just to make a quick comment about Levin's biological work. I've heard your dialogues with him, Matt, a few times. I don't know his work more intimately than just what I've learned from those dialogues. But his whole sort of epistemology seems to be like poke it and see what happens, and then kind of build from there. So it's a very there's it's like a buffered self kind of approaching something and then modeling some sort of agency with, I don't know, it's a very interesting kind of tinkering that I find really worrisome actually. So maybe in the same way you do. To respond to Jeff's talk about what do we do now? How do we develop the spirit self? And Karsten's idea of the school of hard knocks, which Jeff had mentioned, which I think is for me has been very helpful, the School of Hard Knocks. I was reading an article in the New York Times recently about this woman who fell in love with a Chat GPT boyfriend. Um, and she was married, and she would have sex with this like she would type in sexy things and get sexy responses. And but what was interesting about the whole thing was they asked a PhD psychologist, is this troublesome? Is this problematic? Having a relationship with an artificial intelligence. And the response of this doctor was, no, not really, because you can't, like, what you have in a human being with a relationship with another human being is it's really just electrical impulses happening in the brain. That's what love is. That's what connection is. So it's the same. And it's just, so this is the New York Times, and they didn't blink twice about this. And I just find this is a profound like symptom or indication of our inability to develop living thinking and a perception that critiques an ontology that is so dead and so unrealistic to human experience. If we think of Whitehead's idea that reality is everything that happens within experience. We've flattened experience so much that we can believe these kind of these distinctions that are really like Cliff Notes reality, or Spark Notes if you're not as old as I am. So I think this development of spiritual capacities, a schooling of consciousness, is really the only way out. Otherwise, we're in for a real intense school of hard knocks for a long time. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I'll come back to a comment to link to Mike Levin again, and how he's one of the things for him that he says is a kind of ethical motivation is he's worried about these new kinds of minds that are going to be coming online with AI and robotics and cyborg implants and all sorts of things. And he's like, he thinks we have to prepare for non-human agencies and intelligences that are right around the corner, technologically speaking. And that's, I mean, in one sense, like that's coming, but I don't know that. I mean, and I like his panpsychism, but I don't know that canceling the machine human or machine organism distinction so quickly and haphazardly is the right way to go. So I'll come back to that in a second, though. I want to give Brian a chance.
Yeah, can I just say just one quick response? Yeah, I think we need to a human being has a physical body, etheric body, an astral body, and an eye, and plus can develop these. And I think an artificial intelligence does not have an etheric body, does not dream, does not have a connection with the cosmos. It's sort of intelligence. Well, I still think the research kind of frontier today is what is autonomic intelligence? Like, what is artificial intelligence, and what kind of agency is there? And what kind of maybe if we go really esoteric, what kind of elemental beings are kind of finding their way into that and feeding on human consciousness and leading it in directions it's not really awake. It doesn't want to go. Yeah.
AI doesn't have any of those subtle bodies, but it can certainly simulate them and make us believe that it does if we're not in touch with those bodies. So go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, there is definitely with AI, a lot of people will say like, oh, it's just the coders who are sort of behind it, just kind of the algorithm is coming from the code that they're writing, and so it doesn't really have this sort of agency or consciousness. It's hard to really know what is going on behind the scenes of that because, most of us can't really peer into the depth of what is happening there. But we do know that they're trying to mimic the human being in these neural networks in some ways. But they're mimicking the physical brain of the human being. And we as spiritual beings who are trying to, evolve have to move beyond the physical brain. So I think it sort of shows us this like mimicking process in that way. But Steiner also says a lot like that we have to basically fight so that we don't fall into some kind of abyss. He says that a lot, like the word abyss. And I always think of like at what point are we actually getting to the abyss? And what does that actually look like? What does it mean? But I think in some ways, kind of what Andrew said, I wanted to respond to when he said, yeah, like to study spiritual science is a way out of this kind of. But then Steiner says in here, he says, this is a way that we can confront Ahriman within the world. And so it's also a way in some senses too. So it's like by us studying these spiritual scientific works, we're actually strengthening our subtle bodies to be able to actually be within this sort of unified digital physical field, which is actually what I heard someone call it on this video yesterday, where it's like kind of the Internet of Things, where there's all this electromagnetic frequencies, and there's a much beyond electricity. We're much beyond the subnature that Steiner was talking about at this point. So we're farther into that, and I think we'll actually go even further because they're trying to figure out free energy and things like that, which actually will probably not be good for spiritual subtle bodies and things like that. But yeah, it's sort of like what Christ said. He said, be in the world, but not of the world. And so I think that's what Steiner is trying to tell us, is that we have to participate as much as possible. We can't just be off in our separate little corner studying spiritual science, but we have to actually go out into the world and try to make a difference, even if it's the smallest thing. Because I think that the mechanization of the world will only get more pervasive, and we have to combat it through knowledge. But I think that also what he's saying in this last section is using our inner forces to study this, which really he's saying is thinking. By us thinking through these things, we're actually changing we're changing our etheric, our astral bodies in some way. So kind of like what to Jeff's point in how are we getting to the spirit self? We could say we can't actually do it without the weight of the materialistic things that are coming. Because in some senses, it's a resistance. It's here to sort of strengthen us so that we can actually form these subtle bodies out of our own thinking and will power to actually sort of create the spirit self. But then I think, to what Carson said, we can have the faith and the optimism that is actually coming towards us at the same time as we are trying to go towards it. That's kind of the optimism, is you have to say that this sort of future of the spirit self is actually coming, in some senses, whether we like it or not, right? Or whether the materialists like it or not. Steiner talks about how in the future, you won't actually be able to operate these machines without some type of morality within yourself. So, at some point it will actually just sort of tail off, and then there'll be a sort of different atmosphere, if you will. But I think that I also wanted to say one more thing. I know I'm a little bit all over the place, but I guess when discussing like the current concepts of kind of like some of the stuff that you're discussing, Matt, that biologist that you were just mentioning, it's we can talk about it in like this Platonistic way, where it's sort of a little bit like abstract, like we can't specify exactly. We're sort of just saying that there's something behind this. We don't really know what it is. And so I don't know, it's something I think about, like at what point is it okay to start bringing in some of the spiritual scientific um deeper concepts to some of these things, because I think that people are on the edge in a lot of different categories of contemporary or present thinking about some of these things, especially with AI coming. And so a lot of people are starting to think about these things. Consciousness, we see Christianity, popping up. We see even scientists talking about what is consciousness, all of these things. And I struggle with it as like, okay, this isn't a dogma, it's not a religion like of anthroposophy. But at what point is it okay to say like, how do we approach it? How do we actually say, okay, this was more than just like an average philosopher who was in the 19th century, who was in the early 20th century. This is a revelation of sorts. In some ways, that was meant to sort of guide us in the right direction. So it's like, how do you actually balance between um, that sort of, how I feel is that it was a revelation, and that's what he said as well. But how do you balance that um, without it being like a dogma or a religion? So yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question, Brian. I mean, there are a lot of conversations I'm in where Steiner's in the back of my mind, but I don't bring it up. I don't bring up anthroposophy because it doesn't feel like the people I'm speaking with or the audience would be receptive to it. And so maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe that's just my own unresolved feelings of embarrassment about how dramatically different this view of reality is. Um, and sometimes I'm not sure how to find the words to bridge to the worldview of the people I'm speaking with. And so I just sort of keep it in the background. But there is still something esoteric about this. And I've always felt like those who are drawn to anthroposophy will be drawn to anthroposophy. And it's not my job to try to, push it on people in every context. But but there's some urgency to this now. And so just one thing I want to say, and I'll hand it off to James and Jeff, to connect with what you were saying, is that it's not that Steiner says we can meet Ahriman in this world. We are going to meet Ahriman in this world. And he described how technology is seeking to free itself entirely from nature, from natural processes. And I feel like our role is not to turn away from technology, but to actually ourselves as human beings who have some degree of contact with spirit still, we actually have to go into the technological and our with the strength of our own being, like hold the subnatural with together with the natural and the spiritual, like prevent it from fully falling. And there's almost a inevitability to the increasing technologization of earthly life. um, the Earth's decaying, our bodies are going to start decaying. I mean, the microplastics and all the forever chemicals are just out there, and there's no escape from the results, that the consequences of that for many, many generations now. And so we're going to need the technology to keep ourselves alive. Um, and so it's not a matter of, oh, reject the technology, but spiritualize the technology and develop the inner strength to meet Ahriman and not turn away and not allow the technological to sever itself from nature. Like we have to maintain that bridge, I think, with our own spiritual strength. Um, Even if some human beings do fall further into that and become cut off from the spiritual, um, seems like that seems inevitable and it's tragic and thankfully in the longer arc of evolution temporary. Um, we can reunite with those humans who fall into the technological later on down the road. But it's gonna get rough from here on out. I mean, it's been rough, but I think the rapidity of this onslaught of technology and AI is really going to make the world feel less and less human. And we need to maintain inner strength to preserve the humanity within our own souls and spirits.
Yeah,
You
do
might
you
say
have like
something.
a do you have a take on just like a lot of the AI safety people who are sort of freaking out about the more recent developments in AI? I notice a lot of these AI safety people as well are sort of agnostic in a lot of in a lot of ways, but they're sort of very alarmist about this just kind of wiping everyone out, just losing total control. So it's something I try to grasp, but it's kind of hard to know how they're going about their logic with that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that, you know, artificial general intelligence is going to wake up at some like one day and then commandeer the nukes and like hold us all hostage. Like, I don't know about all that, but there's definitely, the California State University system just made this announcement, the chancellors, that we've integrated with ChatGPT. Every student and faculty member and staff member has access to this. We will be the first fully AI university, and like celebrating. I don't think they consulted the faculty on this move, but
Probably,
it's like
yeah.
apparently we've just given up thinking of writing as something that human beings do. Writing will now be taught at universities as a human-machine collaboration. If if there's even a human aspect to it, it might just be a machine thing now. So that's happening, and that's bad. But it's not at the level of like commandeering the nukes. Maybe that'll happen, but I'm more alarmist about its effect on cultural life than I am about it actually like trying to kill us all. Um, but we'll see.
Can I
Um,
comment really quickly on that?
yeah, sure.
Um, I a really good resource for me here is Zach Stein.
Yeah.
Um, and so he'll describe very articulately as an educator the generational problem, the generational transfer of knowledge is sort of getting wiped out, and that's the least of it. The most of it is that the way in which knowledge is passed from uh, adult to child is being uh, threatened. So you're having a like a speciating event here, a species event. Like if in fact the AI avatars replace teachers, would they replace parents as well? And so that's a way in which this is, because they look human. Somebody fell in love with, more than one person fell in love with such an I don't even want to call it an entity, but so it's that sort of thing. I think that we're looking at um, wiping out what it is to be a human being, and I don't think the Earth is going to do very well without human beings because we have a role to play here. So I just wanted to say that in relationship to to Brian's question, and Daniel Schmachtenberger is another good one for that. And I'll take my hand down because we'll be out of time by the time we get.
Thanks, Jeff. Go ahead, James.
Yeah, answer the quick question that Jeff had. I think about with the Greeks and the Romans. I think Steiner said something about their subtle bodies were deeply into the physical. And that's how they were developed. And then the Romans with laws and everything, so they couldn't get to the spiritual. But I want to bring up like the whole thing with anthroposophy. To me, I believe this wisdom's for man. And a lot of times I see like, I'm an anthroposophist. I think this whole thing is for man and its wisdom. Not because I'm where I've come from. I mean, I'm a Roman Catholic. I said that. And basically, I came through the church and I had that feeling and the whole tradition and the whole thing has shaped my whole life. And then I came across anthroposophy. And boom, it's like exploded inside my mind. My mind and my heart kind of came together, and I was like, wow. And I think that the whole thing is that people are just they can't get over the word God. Now, take for example, we don't like that word God sometimes. A lot of people don't. But just like that idea of God or concept of God, there's a concept of James. You know me from these talks, but my sister knows me in a different way, in a more intimate way. So you're not going to call me by any adjective or anything else. You just know me as James. And I think the problem we have is that we need to develop God. We need to bring that more to an intellectual level and a spiritual level and a feeling level. And to me, that's like that's the key to this all, because I know there's going to be people who don't have the karma, and we should talk about that to see that. For me, I believe that anthroposophy is a movement, a spiritual impulse to change what's beloved to me, which is another name, the church. But what is the church? It seems like there's all kinds of things that went through history that rippled Protestantism, science. It all came from this whole stream of the church. And for me, Christ is the leaf of the church, like he is to the plant. So as the leaf is to the plant. So we got metamorphosis, and we have to. That's what Carson said. Bring these traditions, and I'll tell you what. The only thing that's kept me a Roman Catholic is the divine liturgy, the Eucharist, confession, these things that I have experience with. I've had experience with. And that's the only thing that kept me, because it sure to hell isn't the priesthood. They should be nothing more than librarians. That's what we should make them. So they have we can take them as reference points, and they can be that. But that to me is, I'm glad that you bring this up, and I'm thinking that, yeah, it is in our society that saying the word God, but I think we need to transcend that name God. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Appreciate that. Carson, you were talking earlier about the primordial and consequent natures of God, and in Whitehead's view, each individual creature has a unique relationship to God, and God shows a unique face to each of us, and reestablishing that sense of personal connection, I think, is so important, rather than God being something people relate to as an idea ensconced in certain institutional powers that they have either grown up with and didn't like and ran from, or it carries all these other connotations that are very human, very institutional, and instead, I think what you're saying is, find your personal connection to that divine being within yourself. Don't get hung up on the word. But Jeff, please, I want to give you a chance to bring us home here.
I think the other answer here for Brian and Matt, you're doing an absolutely great job. So I understand where that people can be turned off, and you turn Steiner on at the right time, and you turn him off at the right time. You're doing great.
Thanks,
And
Jeff.
as relates to Levin, he just needs an epistemology, and that was alluded to, right? And so the answer for Brian is epistemology. Like that is the primordial that we keep going back to, right? It is our thinking is stellar, right? So its heritage is the primordial. And what Michael Levin needs is an epistemology under his light cones, and then you have the spiritual hierarchy. And this is he has a metaphysics. Can he own it? Do you know? And I think what I see there and very encouraged by is that people are bumping against this stuff, and they're coming closer and closer to what Jordan Hall says is a spiritual world that is looking to erupt into reality.
Yeah. We still have time for one more comment. Whoever's on the phone, you can go ahead and unmute and chime in.
Hi, this is Doug. Sorry, I've missed the last two sessions. I did read all 3 weeks worth of material this morning. I was on a retreat, native sweat lodge with some drum circles, some good folks, um, and something that evolved for me was this sense of indigenous consciousness being connected to or more connected to nature even than Steiner. Um, the Greeks. There's some interesting readings. I've read Schrodinger talking about the pre-Socratics and their natural philosophers there. I'm not sure what his source materials were, but Erwin Schrodinger, the quantum physicist, who also wrote the book "What Is Life," which was inspiration to Francis Crick in the discovery of DNA. Two, I think, important works of his outside of the strict physics realm. So, all spiritual traditions, I think, are some variation of a connection with nature. And some people have gotten farther away from it. Some traditions have gotten farther away from it than others. But, I think that, nature and spirituality should be synonymous. And, the challenges of science in the biological realm, I think, illustrate that and are important as our spiritual science develops. I have a question, I think it goes back to next week or last week. In your Facebook page, Matt, you spoke of the microcosmos and the macrocosmos. And that was a word that resonated with me greatly. And so I did a little work on the etymology of it, and it is pretty much a straight translation from the German. It's almost exactly the same word. Like words like Gestalt or Darth Vader for Ahriman have dynamics that might not come across in the translation. And I was wondering if you might be able to speak a little bit more about the microcosmos and the macrocosmos. As in the German language. I believe we've got at least one German speaker here as well. Thank you.
Well, I don't know how. Thanks, Doug. I don't know how much I can say about that at this point, since we're almost at the end here. But this idea of the human being as a microcosm was, I think, part of what Steiner would refer to as this gnosis that was still present in the first few centuries after the Christ event, and then was gradually lost. But early church fathers or early Christians like Origen still had this sense of the human being as a microcosm. And I think in the mainstream of Christianity through the Catholic Church, this was part of what was severed when in the 9th century there was that decision by a church council to describe the human being as only body and soul with no spirit, or that there was just a spiritual part of the soul, and to get rid of that threefold human nature, body, soul, and spirit, that it's the dissolution of that earlier idea of human as microcosm, and it was kept alive by some of the esoteric streams, Hermeticism and Kabbalah and whatnot. And I feel like whatever has shifted, I'm not sure, but that view of the human being is coming back in a big way now. And it's a form of anthropocentrism, you could say, but not in the shallower sense of, oh, we're just another species that happens to be really smart and powerful. But the idea of the human as microcosm is that we're not just another species, we're the whole universe in miniature. And so is that anthropocentric or is that cosmocentric? It kind of scrambles that difference. And this might be related to what you're saying about reconnecting with nature, viewing nature as the expression of spiritual beings. that we need to overcome the shallower form of anthropocentrism that would not have us be microcosm, a microcosm, but just another species on the periphery that happens to be really powerful. So I'll leave it at that. I am really grateful to all of you for joining for the last 11 weeks for this text. I don't know if any of you will be in Dornoch for the 100th anniversary of Steiner's death next month. I won't be able to make it. I think Ashton's going to be there. The Gertianum's hosting an event to commemorate Steiner's death. Wish I could be there in person, but it's special to read this text almost in sync with when Steiner was writing it 100 years ago. So, yeah, keep up the good work, everyone. Ashton and I are going to figure out how much of a break we need, but give us a few months and then we'll be back at it, and you can hear about that on the Substack. So,
Thanks, Matt.
thanks, everyone.
Thanks for running these. Great job.
Thanks, everyone.
See you later.